Every morning, before the world speaks to you, before messages arrive, before expectations press against your chest, there is a quiet moment where your life can still go in any direction. Most people sleepwalk through it. They wake up already surrendered, already reacting, already letting yesterday bleed into today. They reach for their phone, absorb other people's chaos, and unknowingly hand over control of their inner state before the day has even begun. By the time they stand up, the battle is already lost. Not because life is cruel, but because they never claimed command of their own mind. The Stoics understood something that modern life has made easy to forget. The first minutes of your morning are not neutral. They are decisive. They shape the tone of your thoughts, the weight of your emotions, and the posture of your spirit for the next 24 hours. This is not motivation, this is positioning. When Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal about waking up and reminding himself that he would meet people who were meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly, he was not being pessimistic. He was preparing his mind for reality so that reality could not ambush him. He was choosing strength before pressure arrived. He was entering the day armored, not hopeful. That distinction matters. Hope is fragile. Preparation is durable. Right now, in those early moments after waking, your mind is soft, receptive, impressionable. Modern science confirms what the Stoics sensed intuitively. The first thoughts you repeat begin to wire patterns that your brain will default to under stress. Most people unknowingly program themselves for distraction, comparison, and emotional reactivity before breakfast. They scroll, they absorb, they compare, and then they wonder why they feel anxious, scattered, or heavy before the day has even started. The Stoic path begins with a refusal to let that happen. It begins with the recognition that your morning is a training ground, not for productivity, but for identity. Who you decide to be in the first minutes of the day is who you will struggle to escape for the rest of it. This is why Stoicism does not start with goals. It starts with self-command. It asks a harder question than most philosophies dare to ask. Who is in charge of your inner world? You, or whatever happens to appear in front of you first? The battlefield of the day is not your job, your schedule, or the people you will meet. The real battlefield is internal. It is the space between what happens and how you respond. Most people believe they are overwhelmed by life because life is too demanding. The Stoics knew the deeper truth. You are not overwhelmed because life is heavy. You are overwhelmed because you have not established authority over your own reactions. When you begin your morning without intention, you drift. When you begin it with clarity, you lead. The difference between those two states compounds silently over time until one person feels trapped inside their own life and the other feels grounded even when circumstances are unstable. This is not talent. This is training. The purpose of the Stoic morning is not to convince yourself that everything will be easy. It is to remind yourself that whatever comes, you are capable of meeting it without collapsing. That reminder must come before the world has a chance to challenge you. When you speak deliberate truths to yourself in the morning, you are not performing affirmations in the modern sense. You are aligning your expectations with reality and your behavior with your values. You are saying, without noise and without drama, I will not be surprised by difficulty today, and I will not be ruled by it either. This is how unshakable people are built, not through bursts of inspiration, but through quiet, repeated acts of mental discipline. Imagine waking up and knowing, not hoping, that your emotional state does not belong to traffic, emails, other people's moods, or unexpected setbacks. Imagine beginning the day with the calm certainty that while you cannot control what unfolds, you can control how you meet it. That certainty is not a feeling, it is a position you take. The Stoics called this inner citadel, a place inside the mind that remains steady regardless of external noise. It is not something you are born with. It is something you construct, one morning at a time, by choosing what you allow into your thoughts before anything else gets there first. This is why the morning matters so much. not because it guarantees success, but because it establishes sovereignty. When you claim the morning, you claim the day. When you fail to claim it, the day claims you. Over time, this difference becomes visible not just in how you feel, but in how you move, how you speak, how you decide, and how much emotional weight you carry. People who begin their days unconsciously spend their lives reacting. People who begin their days deliberately learn to respond. That single shift changes everything. What follows next are not motivational slogans or empty positivity. They are grounded Stoic declarations designed to align your mind with reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. Each one addresses a specific weakness that keeps people stuck in cycles of stress, hesitation, and self-doubt. Together, they form a mental framework that does not collapse under pressure. But none of it works if this foundation is missing. The understanding that your morning is not a routine, it is a battlefield, and the outcome depends on whether you show up as a participant or as a commander. Before anything else happens today, remember this: you do not wake up to see what the day will do to you. You wake up to decide who you will be no matter what the day brings. The first truth a Stoic claims each morning is simple, uncomfortable, and life-changing. You are responsible for how today feels, not responsible for what happens, not responsible for other people's choices, not responsible for random events or unfair circumstances, but responsible for your internal response to all of it. Most people resist this idea because it removes their favorite escape: blame. Blaming the traffic, the weather, the boss, the past, the economy, or someone else's attitude feels easier than accepting responsibility for your own emotional state. But ease is expensive. It costs you power. The moment you believe your mood is controlled by external conditions, you surrender authority over your life. The Stoics refused to live like that. Marcus Aurelius did not wake up believing the world would be kind to him. He woke up prepared for friction, resistance, and human weakness. Yet he remained composed because he understood a deeper law. Nothing outside your mind can force you to suffer unless you cooperate with it internally. This is not denial. This is discipline. When you accept responsibility for how today feels, you stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances and start seeing yourself as a participant in your own experience. That shift is subtle, but it is the foundation of emotional freedom. Most people wake up already reactive. They check messages, scroll news, absorb tension, and let those inputs decide the tone of the day. Before they have spoken a single intentional thought, they have already outsourced their emotional state. A Stoic does the opposite. He pauses. He claims responsibility before anything else enters. He reminds himself that emotions are signals, not commands. That frustration may appear, but it does not get to drive. That anxiety may knock, but it does not get the keys. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means refusing to be governed by it. When you tell yourself in the morning that you are responsible for how today feels, you are not promising constant happiness. You are promising coherence. You are saying that whatever emotion arises, you will meet it with awareness instead of reflex. You recognize disappointment without drowning in it. You feel anger without acting from it. You experience stress without becoming it. This is what separates emotional maturity from emotional chaos. One reacts automatically. The other responds deliberately. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this responsibility. You stop scanning the environment for permission to feel okay. You stop waiting for circumstances to improve before you allow yourself peace. You begin the day grounded, knowing that while events are unpredictable, your inner posture does not have to be. This is why the Stoics placed such emphasis on judgment, not because events are irrelevant, but because meaning is optional. Two people can face the same situation and walk away with completely different inner outcomes. The difference is not the event, it is the interpretation. When responsibility becomes your default, excuses dissolve. You no longer say, "This ruined my day," or "They made me feel this way." You say, "This happened, and I choose how to meet it." That choice restores dignity. It returns control to where it belongs, inside you. Over time, this practice reshapes your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone constantly impacted by life and start seeing yourself as someone who moves through life with steadiness. This responsibility is not heavy, it is relieving, because once you accept it, you stop fighting the uncontrollable and start investing energy where it actually matters. Your thoughts, your reactions, your behavior, your values. The morning declaration is not meant to hype you up. It is meant to anchor you, to remind you that today does not get to decide who you are. You decide that first. And from that decision, everything else follows. As this responsibility settles in, something important begins to happen. You realize that peace is not something you chase later in the day after problems are solved. It is something you establish before problems appear. That realization naturally leads to the next Stoic truth. If you are responsible for how today feels, then your peace is not open access. It requires boundaries. And boundaries begin with permission. Once you accept responsibility for how today feels, the next truth becomes unavoidable. Nothing can disturb your peace without your permission. This is where Stoicism separates itself from surface-level motivation and enters discipline. Most people believe peace is fragile, something that can be stolen by a comment, a delay, a mistake, or another person's mood. The Stoics understood the opposite. Peace is not fragile. It is guarded or unguarded, and every morning, whether consciously or not, you choose which one it will be. Your mind is not a public space. It is a private territory. Yet most people leave it wide open. They let every opinion walk in. Every criticism sits down. Every worry unpacks its bags and stays longer than invited. By the time the day begins, their inner world is already crowded, noisy, and tense. Not because life attacked them, but because they never decided what was allowed inside. A Stoic begins the day by closing the gate, not aggressively, calmly, intentionally. When you declare that nothing can disturb your peace without your permission, you are not claiming that nothing unpleasant will happen. You are claiming authority over your response. You are acknowledging that events may knock, but they do not get automatic access. There is a pause, a checkpoint, a moment where you choose how deeply something is allowed to enter. Most people never experience this pause. They react instantly. The Stoic trains himself to notice it. That pause is where power lives. In that brief space between stimulus and response, you decide whether a comment becomes an insult, whether a delay becomes frustration, whether uncertainty becomes fear. Without that pause, emotions run the show. With it, emotions become information, not commands. This is what inner security actually looks like. Not numbness, not detachment from life, but the ability to remain centered while life moves around you. Many people confuse peace with avoidance. They think protecting peace means withdrawing from challenges or hard conversations. Stoic peace is different. It is active, not passive. You can engage fully while remaining internally steady. You can hear criticism without absorbing it. You can face pressure without panicking. You can acknowledge difficulty without letting it define your state. Peace is not the absence of noise. It is independence from it. When you stop granting automatic permission to everything that happens, you begin to notice how much of your stress was optional. Not because the situation was meaningless, but because your immediate reaction was unnecessary. You realize that much of what disturbs you only does so because you rush to interpret it. You assumed intent. You personalized behavior. You filled silence with stories. Once you slow that process down, disturbances lose their grip. This boundary also changes how others interact with you. People sense when your emotional state is not easily accessible. They feel it in your calm responses, your measured words, your lack of urgency to defend or explain. This does not make you cold, it makes you grounded. And grounded people are difficult to manipulate, provoke, or destabilize. Not because they are stronger externally, but because they are governed internally. As you practice this truth, you will notice something subtle. Your energy becomes quieter, but heavier, less reactive, more deliberate. You stop leaking attention into things that do not deserve it. You stop negotiating with every thought. You stop treating every irritation as a crisis. Peace stops being something you hope for and becomes something you protect. But once you protect your peace, a new challenge appears. You begin to notice how often your attention drifts toward things you cannot control. Other people's reactions, outcomes, timing, uncertainty. And this is where many lose their footing again, because peace cannot survive where attention is scattered across the uncontrollable. That is why the next Stoic principle is not optional, it is essential. Once you have claimed responsibility for your inner state and set boundaries around your peace, the next discipline becomes clear. You must focus only on what you can control. This is where most people quietly exhaust themselves without realizing why. They wake up already burdened, already tense, already overwhelmed, not because they have too much to do, but because their attention is scattered across things they were never meant to carry. Other people's opinions, outcomes that haven't happened yet, mistakes from the past, possibilities they cannot influence. The Stoics saw this as one of the greatest sources of unnecessary suffering. Epictetus divided life into two simple categories: what is up to you and what is not. That distinction sounds obvious, yet almost no one lives by it. Most people spend the majority of their mental energy trying to control the uncontrollable while neglecting the few things that are actually within reach. They worry about how they are perceived instead of how they behave. They obsess over results instead of effort. They fear the future instead of acting in the present. This inversion creates constant anxiety because the mind is working against reality instead of with it. When you begin the day by focusing only on what you can control, you immediately feel lighter, not because your responsibilities disappear, but because your attention becomes precise. You stop dragging the weight of the entire world behind you. You bring your energy back to your words, your actions, your choices, your discipline. This is where influence actually exists, not in worrying, not in predicting, not in replaying scenarios that may never happen. The Stoic does not ignore outcomes, he simply refuses to be ruled by them. He understands that effort is his responsibility, but results belong to forces larger than him. This distinction protects him from despair when things go wrong and from arrogance when things go right. He shows up fully, acts deliberately, and then releases attachment to how things unfold. That release is not weakness, it is clarity. It allows consistent action without emotional volatility. When your focus remains inside your circle of control, stress loses its grip. You stop asking why things are unfair and start asking what the next right action is. You stop measuring yourself against variables you cannot influence and start measuring yourself against your own standards. This builds a quiet confidence that does not fluctuate with circumstances. You feel steady because your sense of worth is no longer tied to external approval or unpredictable outcomes. This focus also sharpens your presence. Instead of being mentally pulled in 10 directions, you become fully engaged in the moment in front of you. Conversations improve, decisions simplify, energy stabilizes. You move through the day with intention instead of tension. The mind becomes a tool instead of a battleground. But there is a deeper layer to this discipline. When you consistently focus on what you can control, you begin to see how much of your self-worth has been outsourced to results. Wins make you feel valuable, losses make you feel diminished. This dependency quietly erodes inner stability. And that realization leads directly into the next Stoic truth. If you want lasting strength, you must separate your value from outcomes. Once you narrow your focus to what you can control, you begin to notice something uncomfortable but liberating. Much of your stress was never about effort, it was about worth. You were not just trying to do well, you were trying to prove something. To yourself, to others, to the world. The Stoics warned against this long before modern psychology gave it a name. When your sense of value depends on outcomes, your inner life becomes unstable. Every success lifts you temporarily. Every setback feels personal. You are no longer acting from principle. You are performing for validation. Seneca understood this intimately. He experienced wealth, power, exile, and death threats. Through it all, he learned a hard truth. External results are temporary. Identity must not be. When you wake up believing your worth will be decided by what happens today, you place your dignity at the mercy of chance. A meeting goes badly, and you feel smaller. A plan fails, and you question yourself. A delay appears, and your confidence collapses. Not because the event was catastrophic, but because you allowed it to measure you. The Stoic refuses this measurement. He does not deny disappointment. He does not pretend failure does not hurt. But he does not let outcomes define who he is. He separates effort from identity. He shows up fully, acts with care, and then lets the result be what it is. This separation creates emotional resilience. You can lose without being diminished. You can win without becoming inflated. Your center remains intact. Most people confuse self-worth with self-esteem. Self-esteem rises and falls with performance. Self-worth remains steady regardless of circumstance. The Stoics anchored themselves in character, not applause. They asked a different question at the end of the day. Did I act with integrity? Did I use reason? Did I remain aligned with my values? These are measurements that cannot be taken away by a bad outcome or an unfair moment. When you internalize this principle, pressure begins to dissolve. You stop waking up feeling like today is a test you must pass to deserve respect. You stop carrying the quiet fear of failure in everything you do. You begin to act more freely because you are no longer protecting an image. You are expressing a standard. This shift changes how you approach work, relationships, and challenges. You become more consistent because your motivation no longer depends on praise or reassurance. There is also humility in this truth. When your worth is not tied to outcomes, you can admit mistakes without collapsing. You can learn without shame. You can adjust without defensiveness. Growth accelerates because ego stops interfering with feedback. You become more teachable, more patient, more grounded. Not because you lowered your standards, but because you stopped confusing results with identity. As this detachment deepens, another realization appears. Knowing what matters and believing in your worth is not enough. Insight without movement becomes stagnation. Many people understand what they should do, but never do it. They intend, they plan, they delay. And intention quietly replaces action. That is why the next Stoic discipline is unavoidable. If you want to live with strength, you must move from thought into behavior. At this point, the path becomes narrow. You understand responsibility. You protect your peace. You focus on what you can control. You no longer tie your worth to outcomes. But none of this matters if it stays in the mind. The Stoics were relentless about this truth. Wisdom that is not lived is useless. Insight without action is just comfort disguised as understanding. This is where most people quietly fail. They know what to do. They agree with it. They even feel inspired by it. And then they do nothing. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he was not born to stay under the covers, thinking noble thoughts. He was born to act, to fulfill his role as a human being. Action, to the Stoics, was not optional. It was the measure of sincerity. You do not become disciplined by admiring discipline. You become disciplined by acting when it is uncomfortable, inconvenient, or uncertain. Most people wait for motivation. They wait to feel ready, confident, inspired, or certain. The Stoics waited for none of that. They understood that motivation is unreliable. Feelings rise and fall. Energy fluctuates. But character is built by consistency, not mood. Action taken without enthusiasm is often more valuable than action taken in excitement because it proves commitment to principle rather than impulse. When you commit to acting instead of merely intending, your identity begins to shift. You stop seeing yourself as someone who plans and start seeing yourself as someone who executes. This changes your self-trust. Every small action kept becomes a vote for the person you are becoming. Every avoided action weakens that trust. Over time, this inner ledger matters more than external validation. You begin to rely on yourself, and that reliance is the foundation of confidence. Stoic action is not reckless. It is deliberate. It does not rush. It does not wait for perfect conditions. It moves forward based on values, not convenience. You act even when the outcome is uncertain, because action itself is within your control. You write even if no one reads. You train even if progress is slow. You speak honestly, even if it is uncomfortable. These actions align you with who you claim to be. There is also humility in action. When you act, you expose yourself to feedback. You risk failure. You leave the safety of thought. But this exposure is necessary. Growth does not happen in imagination. It happens in friction. The Stoics did not seek ease. They sought strength, and strength is always forged through doing. As you practice this discipline, something subtle changes. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop debating whether you should act and start asking how you will act. Momentum builds, clarity sharpens. Life becomes simpler because action cuts through confusion. Many problems resolve themselves once movement begins. This is not about grand gestures, it is about daily alignment. One conversation handled with integrity, one task completed despite resistance, one habit honored even when no one is watching. These are the actions that shape a life, not intentions, not promises, not future plans. And as action becomes your default, you begin to see challenges differently. Obstacles stop feeling like interruptions and start feeling like invitations, which leads naturally to the final realization. If action is constant and worth is stable, then difficulty itself must be reinterpreted, not as a threat, but as training.